Hi, Dan. So, thank you so much for joining me today. It's wonderful to be able to connect with you and have a conversation. Um, so, let's get straight into this. Why don't I let you get started? Tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, your journey into data, and maybe even touch on how we've met.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me. So I spent my career in real estate. So I studied engineering at university and then went into the world of construction, where I worked in a variety of different roles. And then moving from construction, I joined what was at the time known as DTZ, now Cushman Wakefield, again in a variety of different roles. And I was looking at the built environment from lots of different perspectives. And in both of those, my roles were more around business development and business strategy and market strategy. But data and technology became more and more of a topic. So we were using it more, whether that's just for listing properties or understanding the analytics and to drive the business. So I was never really on the data side of things specifically, but I was coming across it more and more. So a lot of my job was really looking into the data and I guess the client of data services. And then I joined Ordnance Survey, which when I was first approached by them, I, like many people, know them and hold them in great affection in terms of the hiking maps. But actually, that's very little about what they do. Most of it is data and analysis and the geospatial data that's used for analytics. And so I moved to Ordnance Survey, looking after their activity in the land and property sector, and then latterly some of the general commercial as well. So looking at things like retail. And then I'd looked across the whole built environment, which I found fascinating. I've looked at a lot of data. The geospatial data sort of underpins everything, but realised that one of the places I hadn't looked so much was the investment world. So I joined MSCI, looking after their global market development side of things. MSCI, again, looking at the investment property values and indices. And then finally joined RICS. My day job at RICS was leading the product management for their data and information products. They've got a wide range, such as BCIS, which is a cost index for construction and running costs. Whilst I was there, I also picked up the mantle of what is technology going to do to the property sector and what do we do about it from an RICS point of view, and as much as RICS influences the market. So I ended up having two slightly different roles there, and that's the one that really got me intrigued in the whole PropTech movement when that came along, which is a term I both like a lot and I'm not very keen on at the same time. Perhaps we can go into that later, but that's my whole environment that I worked in. So I started Alpha Property Insight 5 years ago, working with a range of different organizations around digital transformation, primarily looking at data and data strategy. So I work with some governments and industry bodies, some tech companies and some real estate companies, all looking at the same side of things and looking at that data, how it's going to change the market, where it's going. And whilst I was there, I also saw across the whole sector lots and lots of people. I was very privileged, especially at RICS, but beforehand, sitting in lots of different meeting rooms, talking about what was happening in different parts of the sector. So land management and planning through to construction and facilities management and investment and valuation and so on. And it struck me that more and more the conversations where it was about data were actually being repeated again and again. And so data in a sector where we're incredibly siloed, it's a well-trodden cliche, but we're vertically siloed. That actually works pretty well, I think, for the sector. We've always worked well like that. So for jobs and skills and industry bodies, that works really well. For data, it doesn't. And data really needs to go across the sector. So the Real Estate Data Foundation is really set up just to try and join those conversations together. That was the primary objective. And since working through that, the secondary part is around data ethics. So the ethical use of data is something that I personally haven't come across anyone in real estate doing something intentionally unethical. I've come across quite a few examples of where people are doing something accidentally that I think most people would consider as unethical. So that's the dual purpose of the Red Foundation, really, try and connect those conversations that are already happening, but are never going to be fully resolved without talking to those other groups. And then secondly, to raise data ethics up the agenda.
Amazing. So it sounds like your journey just naturally took you, without you realizing even, into data, face forward, if you like.
Yeah, exactly.
So I will come back to your point about PropTech and why you have sort of like a a bit of a deviation away from that, but I'd love to talk a little bit about the Red Foundation first of all, because that's how we met. Ultimately, you invited me to join the Data Ethics Steering Committee, and I'm so glad you did. And I agree with you. I think that, you know, with data ethics, it's not a case of saying you're doing anything purposefully unethical, but it's really about how do you make sure that you're mindful in implementing ethical data practices. And certainly I've learned a huge amount being a part of that. So can we talk a little bit more? I think you touched a little bit around the purpose of the Red Foundation, but can you talk a little bit more around how it's structured and some of the benefit that that you see coming out of that, but also a little bit of a direction. So what's the vision and how you see it kind of progressing?
Yeah, sure. So I think that the heart of the Red Foundation is really that there are lots of great organizations already doing great stuff around data and doing standards or talking about all sorts of different training, or the Red Foundation isn't trying to do any of that. It is quite literally just trying to put some of those initiatives together, and it's really trying to join conversations so we don't inadvertently reinvent the wheel, which is something that real estate is pretty guilty of. And if you look at something like sustainability, top of the agenda quite rightly at the moment, if you actually look at how we measure sustainability, it means different things to different people at different times. The data is available, but it's often not shared. The standards that are out there are varied. And so you can have two people talking about the same building. One thinks it's a brilliant building from a sustainability point of view, one thinks it's a terrible building, and both are right. They're just talking about it from different perspectives. And for a sector that really needs to have quite a big impact on sustainability, because we're responsible for so much, that isn't really sustainable, forgive the pun. So the way that it's being brought together is that we want to look at these things and just bring people into a virtual big room to talk about it. But the other problem is it is really complicated. And so we need to bring lots and lots of different perspectives together. So if we pick on data ethics as an example, there is a legal aspect to it. There's a practitioner point to it. There's the data point to it. There's all sorts of different perspectives, and offices and residential is either very similar or very different depending on your perspective. And so the Red Foundation is set up with 3 steering groups. Really, they're working groups focused on 3 different topics. So data ethics, which you're part of. I'm delighted you did accept to join, so thank you very much. But data ethics, which is working on how we raise data ethics across the sector. We can go into a little bit more detail there, but in particular, it's got some 6 principles that we ask companies to sign up to and work towards. And that's something that the industry bodies that support the Red Foundation are promoting. And recently, the Data Ethics Steering Group published a playbook which takes it to that next level about, okay, we've got the principles, what do we now do and how do we implement it and where does it go next? So there's some really good practical guidance around what is data ethics, what should we do about it, at least to get started, and how do we apply it? The problem with data ethics is that we do think about what data is possible. So if we can get the data, that's great. We think a lot about whether it's legal, which is obviously very important, but we very rarely think about that should question. Should we be collecting it? Should we be using it? And that's where it becomes more complex and subjective, but also probably as important as the other 2. There's also data standards. So we have a number of different organizations coming together, really looking at data standards. And we're just trying to work out what is out there, how do they work together, and strive to see where there are opportunities for overlap or efficiency or connecting them. One data standard for the whole of the built environment is never going to work and never should be tried. But if we can at least make sure that they're a little bit more interoperable and we're aware of what's out there, then we can move forwards. There have been examples in the past where 2, 3, or maybe even more very credible groups of organizations have come together to try and create something very, very similar. And that's going to cause problems in the market. And then the final one is around academia and research. There are some amazing academics and researchers in the property sector who are more and more looking at either using data to inform their research, or they're researching directly on some of the use of data and technology. But they're not always as joined up as maybe they are, and there's an opportunity for us to take what are often very, quite rightly, academic heavy reports and to try and communicate that a little bit more. So there are 3 working groups, one on academic research, one on data standards, and one on data ethics. And then finally, there's an overall steering group for governance. So that's chaired by Damien Wiles. and has a number of representatives, including the chairs from those three groups, who meet on a quarterly-ish basis just to make sure that the organisation has some sort of governance and direction of where it's going. And very usefully, it's got a number of different people with very different perspectives on the property sector at different angles, so they can bring together the construction or the geospatial or the investment and so on.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think one of the things that I would say about the Red Foundation, and partly, well, a big reason that I, accepted to join as well, is the fact that it's not for profit. And it is really about everyone coming in together in order to do the right thing for the industry. And I think this is something that you and I have talked about quite significantly. It is a case of sharing, collaborating, aligning on a perspective across the industry and doing it for the good of everybody else, right? So a lot of this this kind of content that's being generated, these are, experienced minds that are sitting and thoughtfully producing some perspectives that can be shared and definitely can be, challenged, I think is the key, because we just want to get better and we want to get to a good point base with that.
Absolutely agree, yeah.
The other thing that you mentioned, which I always think is interesting, is people talk a lot about ESG and sustainability, and obviously climate crisis is a massive issue at the moment. But one of the things that I always find really interesting is aligning on what we mean by sustainability and ESG. I mean, we use those two terms interchangeably, but actually sustainability is only a part of ESG, right? And there's a part of me that thinks one of the really good things about the standards working group or steering committee in particular is aligning on some of those definitions. It's trying to, first of all, I'm a big believer in define it before you can start to create an action plan around it. So I think that's super interesting that you said that. Now, I guess I want to go back and touch on your comment about PropTech, because my next conversation or question was really going to be around challenges, but I really want to hear from you. Why don't you like the term PropTech? What's wrong with it?
Well, I do, but I don't, which makes no sense at all. So let me sort of try and expand on that. So the real estate sector, I think it's fair to say, has never been that good with technology. It's never used it that much. We're quite slow, stable. But in many ways, actually, that's the beauty of the property sector. So it isn't really a criticism. We've never really needed to be particularly technology driven, particularly data driven. So whilst we often get criticised about being behind the times, I don't think that's, and whilst I think that's probably true, I don't think that's necessarily a fair criticism, because I don't think we've needed to. And I think the real estate sector is, generally speaking, catching up pretty fast. We're making really good strides. Of course, it could be a lot faster. And so PropTech as a term of property and technology coming together is a really helpful umbrella term to say that the world is changing. Everything is becoming more digital, and there are all the other buzzwords around fintech or insurtech or whatever it is. So the property sector is changing because of tech. It covers a huge gambit of people, whether that's artificial intelligence through to data collection, through to spreadsheets, through to AVMs, through to virtual reality, and everything in between. So as an umbrella term showing property and technology coming together, I think it's really valuable and useful. So that's the like part of it. Where I think it gets problematic is that it then gets used in lots of different ways. So it's often used to mean something. It's either communicated as a threat, or it's used as a sales tool, or it's talking about a small part of the market like startups. Startups are incredibly important. I think it's something that just wasn't viable, 10, 20 years ago, and they really are now. They're driving a lot of the change. But also, companies themselves, the real estate companies, are investing in lots of stuff. Occupiers are investing in it. There are some really big tech companies who are moving into this space. Some have been around for a long time. And so for me, PropTech as a term covers all of that change. It is the coming together of property and technology and means nothing else. I think it sometimes can be misused and termed used to mean very specific things, which takes away the focus from this overall transformation. So that's the bit that I like less. So I do like PropTech. I just think it needs to be used in the right way.
It's again, it's that issue with terminology that's used interchangeably for things. So the interesting thing that I never really put too much thought about, but I kind of always confused me is the difference between prop tech and CRE tech. I don't know if it's factions of the same thing or if it's the same thing but different terms for it. Can you clarify
I
that?
think I can. So I think it depends on who you ask is probably the answer. So CRE-tech would typically be more looking at the corporate real estate side of things, I think. But I think there's probably more of a geographical blend here. So CRE-tech is probably more from the US point of view originally, and PropTech probably more from here. I think in the UK we use the term property in particular in a very general way, and sometimes that doesn't translate quite as well as it does elsewhere. So I would say pretty much they're the same thing. They're just slightly different terms for them. And I would, being based in the UK, being completely biased, say that PropTech is the one that's probably come out on top. But to be perfectly honest, it doesn't really matter. The property sector, whether it's called CRE-tech, PropTech, or anything else, is slowly adapting to technology. It comes with great benefits, great risks and challenges. And so whatever buzzword is used underneath it, if it's helping to drive change, I think that's a good thing.
Is though, I think it's amazing the fact that there's so much in the marketplace and there is a technology for every problem that you ever thought that you might have within the real estate context, right? Like anything that you really used to have a problem with now has a platform, a startup, something to tackle it. But what about the data? Because ultimately, having spent the bulk of my career, dealing with real estate data and the challenge of integrating said data, which is a whole story in its own right. Do you think that people are thinking about how to improve the baseline quality of that data before creating a new piece of technology in order to cover a challenge or resolve some issue?
I think the early leaders are now starting to, yes, but I think as a general market, probably not a great deal. I think it's worth just dwelling on real estate. And again, I don't think we're very good with data, but that isn't necessarily a criticism as long as we get our act together and move quite quickly. So if you look at real estate, I'm probably talking a little bit more here about commercial real estate, but actually it applies to all properties really, and infrastructure it is really slow moving. In many ways, the fact it's counter-cyclical makes it an attractive investment. Leases used to be 25 years long. So once you signed your lease, yes, there are break clauses, but you're there for a long time. People would never leave your company. So you had a job for life. All of those things mean once you're in place, things were very, very slow to move. And everything's getting quicker and quicker. Now, because everything is very financially driven, historically, we've been looking at metrics in terms of how big is the building. So it's about the physical attributes, or what's the rent, or what's the yield, or what's the capital value. So we just look at those numbers about how big is the building and what are the financials. So we've never had to have data that moves fast. We can afford to report quarterly or annually and to make very slow decisions. And we've only ever really looked at data, which is the financial data or the attributes of the building, like the size or the number of floors. So historically, we haven't had the experience of needing data that is beyond those categories or that is fast moving. Now, the problem is that's all changing. And so now we do need to understand the sustainability impact, because if you're not doing the right thing, people simply won't sign up to your office building. We do need to have an environment that attracts workers, because if they don't like the building they're working in, people are now, and there's evidence that people now leave their job because they don't like the building they're in. And so all of that is now starting to come through, and it tends to be at the higher end of the market, but it's evolving where all of these different factors are becoming more and more important in deciding how long you go somewhere. And also, if you don't like the answer, then you can move much quicker because leases are coming down, flexible working is going up. And so we're moving from this world where everything is very, very narrowly focused on small amounts of data and it's very slow moving, to now needing huge amounts of data and it's very fast moving. And that transition is really, really difficult for us to do. So I think a lot of companies are starting to think about it, but what they often want is that solution that gives them the full answer that needs all of that quick moving data, because other sectors can do it. If you look at some of the, financial services or pharmaceuticals or whatever it might be, they've been on this journey for a long, long time. They get those answers and people want to jump to the answers without the underlying data. And I think that's where a lot of the problem the problem comes in. If you ask for a dashboard, which is great and very helpful, it's a brilliant way of communicating, but the dashboard is really just a communication of the data that's underpinning it. And if you don't have the data there, it doesn't really matter how nice the dashboard is. It's going to be very hard to get the answer out of it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think we've had conversations about my my perspective on dashboards. I love them, but I also hate them. A bit like your challenge with the word PropTech.
Dashboards is your PropTech, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this might be a little bit controversial, but recently, and it's interesting you talk about this change in terms of the volume of data, but also the way that, the industry and actors within the industry are now dealing with data and reacting to it and demanding from it. So the controversial bit is that I am increasingly starting to hear and have conversations with people that are championing increased volumes of open data. And by that, it means that now, can owners and occupiers start to share some information, some basic stats essentially about the property that they're sitting in, for the benefit of the wider industry. And I know that there's certain sensitivities, let's say, when it comes to that. But I like the idea that we can now, tap into a much wider pool of data, and be able to start to generate some insights and kind of help each other. But that might make me sound like a bit like a communist. I'm a communist when it comes to data. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's probably worth unpacking that into a number of different bits. So the first thing is to talk about open data. So if we talk about the UK specifically, although the same principles really apply, normally that means something that's published under an open license. There's absolutely a role for that. There are certain things that are absolutely should be published under open data. I think probably what we're talking about here more is a broader conversation about sharing data. So open data, yes, I think it absolutely has a role to play. I don't think everything should be open by default, because all data, whether it's free to us at the point of use or not, has a cost to it. And so that needs to be considered somewhere. And so just to manage it, keep it up to date, there should be something. So an MP's expenses, clearly open data, it's good for transparency and understanding it. Some things need huge amounts of funding, and it's an industry just to create the data, and therefore it's much harder to create it. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be open. It just means that it needs to be thought through a little bit more about the business case. So I think that's open data specifically. More generally about sharing, then there are a few problems that we have. So the first thing is we're just not used to having to share data, because a little bit because of what I said earlier about those, the rents, the yields, the capital, financial values, and also the metrics of the building. We're not very good at sharing those, although actually we are, because we've done it for years through things like e.g. Radius or CoStar or whatever it might be. So there is data that we share. There is also principles out there. So two companies I work for, IPD, which is now MSCI, has the real estate investment indices. You've got BCIS, which collects all the construction and running cost side of things. So as a sector, we actually have got really good case studies of where we share data, where we are then able to access it. And yes, it costs money, because it costs money to put these things together and to manage them, but it allows us to get benefits out of it. However, we don't have the overall culture of giving data away. And there's an expression which I really don't like, and there's no real upside to this, which is data is the new oil. Now, I don't like that expression for a number of reasons, but in particular because it drives behavior to say, this has got to have value one day. Therefore, I'm just going to collect as much data as I can. I'm going to hold on to everything. And I think that I wouldn't encourage any organization to just willfully share everything. But I do think there are some things which are going to be massively beneficial for us to share, which are just beneficial to the market. And part of that is because, again, we are a little bit different from other sectors. So even if you take the very biggest organizations in the real estate sector, whether that's construction or property management or investment, they all actually have a pretty small market share. In the big scheme of things, they're all relatively small. So no one has a really good view of the whole market on the whole. And so if you're talking about, if we go back to ESG, which I mean, I completely agree with your point there, and narrow it down to sustainability, and even that I think needs narrowing down, because most people are talking about energy use or carbon, operational or embodied carbon. But even if we're talking about energy use, being able to see what other buildings' energy are using is something that, if it's done in the right way, would be really helpful. So you can see your building and your portfolio is performing really well or really badly, and it gives you a really good opportunity. but we don't naturally do that. We don't really want to go out because it could be valuable, or it could be private information, or it could be commercially sensitive. And so we're not very good at having that conversation and taking it through. We're definitely getting better, and those conversations are happening more and more, but it does need to be thought through. And I don't think culturally we instantly assume that we're in the right place to do it.
I do actually agree with you. I think it has to be done, sensitively and carefully, not just for the culture and from a commercial standpoint, but also from a data privacy standpoint and a just general data security standpoint, I would say. And this is a nice little segue to talk about that in the context of smart buildings and the increased digitization of our ecosystem as a whole. And of course, I know that you've got a digital risk assessment that you have built. So I'd love to hear about your views kind of in the context of security rather than commercial. What's coming up? What should we be scared of?
Well, I think that, okay, so yes, I've spent the last couple of years going down the rabbit hole of security risk, that side of things within buildings. And if you look into it, every time you open a door, you find another 10 doors behind it. So I already knew it was a big subject, and every time I look into a particular topic, it gets bigger and bigger. But to try and break it down into simple things, I think the first thing is technology has loads of benefits. They are well documented. And so none of this is about don't use data and technology. If there's a benefit, if you have a clear reason why you're using it and you've got a clear output, then technology should always be part of the answer. Just don't use it for tech's sake. But if you are using it, you've got a clear advantage, then it's worth thinking through some of the downsides and the challenges of that as well. And most risks, not all, but most risks that you face are comparatively easy to at least reduce or mitigate, and in some cases can be completely removed for not a huge amount of effort or challenge. Most risks that happen in hindsight can be really, really problematic and really, really expensive. And so my overall message is technology is really positive. It shouldn't stop you doing it, but just be aware of those challenges and risks. And I think we go in the toolkit, it goes down into breaking into lots of different areas and then going through what might be there. But you can start off by looking at some of these things around data privacy. It's something that people will know a lot about. GDPR comes in, but how often are you captured by a camera and then you don't know what's being done with the data? How often do you give away your medical records and your temperature, something that 3 or 4 years ago no one would have ever done. It'd been an odd thing to say, but during COVID, that's exactly what we did. How much do we give away in the building, and how does a building owner manager manage that data and make sure that it's transparent about what we're doing? Facial recognition then is the step further. So it takes it into really getting quite a lot of analysis. And there are some brilliant use cases of facial recognition, whether that's for security of a building or whether it's understanding the performance of a building. But it also can feel really intrusive. So some retailers in the South have recently got into challenges with using facial recognition. King's Cross got into challenges with using facial recognition. So the brand and the damage there is as much about brand and reputation as it is about the technology itself. You've got some very simple things. So if you put in a piece of hardware, does it actually communicate with the other pieces of hardware? And that's a real challenge, because very often things are put in little bits rather than as a system, especially sort of retrofitting. And then if they are in there, even if they do comply, how do you make sure that they're kept up to date? So both the software and the hardware, because security flaws have come across everything all the time, and patches are done and things need to be updated. And if they're not updated, they're either not supported or they could be at risk. And then you start getting into more of the cyber type of risks, which is more about people harmfully doing things to your building. Now, that could be hacking into a system. It could be going through a door access system. It could be all sorts of different things. I think we started seeing that happen on a small amount of time, a small number of cases. They are obviously going to be the sort of thing people don't want to share. So they are the sort of stories that aren't going to come out too often because people aren't going to be massively public about it. But I think we are going to see more and more cyber attacks on buildings where people specifically attack for commercial purposes, for their own entertainment, which I think is pretty sad reflection on them, or for holding people to ransom or whatever it might be. There's then the connectivity that if you have a building, if you look at something like safe buildings. So after Grenfell, clearly there's a problem with fire. And you can put all sorts of technology in to be part of the solution of making a building safer. So in terms of the alarms and the detectors, and you can have sprinkler systems, and you can have communications for everyone to do things. You can have the evacuation lifts. It's all fantastic, but it's all connected. It's all electric and connectivity based. And so if just something goes out of line, how do you make sure that that's up all the time to make sure that the building remains safe? And then finally, probably, which is a slightly more science fiction, but I think is going to be happening more and more, is we have seen external data being used all the time to inform decisions. It could just be basic traffic information. How do I get from here to here? How long is the commute? Therefore, will I buy a particular property? But all of that data that's used externally can be manipulated, or at least we need to question whether it has been manipulated. Now, often it isn't because there's no incentive to. But as that becomes more important to value, to commercial decisions happening, we have to start asking whether data itself that we're using, that we're just assuming is correct, has been manipulated. And there are all sorts of things like the deep fakes that you can see of people that are out there. You can see the chat GPT. All of these things, the artificial intelligence and the technology can start creating really credible false information. And so from a building owner, we've gone from having to manage the buildings, the flood risk, and making sure the door's locked at the right time, to all of a sudden having all this technology in place, which comes with loads of benefits about making it run more efficiently, and it's better for people, but it also comes with some risk and challenges. And we're very good about thinking about those from the physical point of view, but less so from the digital.
That is, I'm happy that you've gone through all of that, because I'll be frank, when I think about digital risk where it relates to properties, my mind immediately goes to kind of cyber attacks, hackers trying to shut down the buildings, etc. But it's interesting for you the way that you've laid it out in this variety of different types of risks. And I did love the fact that you started off with actually ethical risks as well, in terms of what technology brings. But this obviously isn't to say that you shouldn't go down that path, because this is a new world order, right? It's we have a new generation that's very much used to, now, here, ease. You have to make sure that properties are also kind of ready for that. And the other thing that I did think about is, it will be interesting to see what impact that has on our culture, because historically you had certain kind of industries and professions that were very much, they relied on the security of physical, appearance or being somewhere. Like, for example, if I was a trader on a trading floor in an investment bank, right, I had to be in the particular property and trading for regulatory purposes. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of that need sort of changes over time as buildings become more digital and have that risk associated to them, versus obviously what we learned during COVID, because all the bankers went home as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've lived in a world for 10, 20 years now of digital screens. So we're very used to dealing with laptops and to mobile phones and tablets, and they're well established now. And so even talking about those in some ways feels quite old fashioned. But we've really had to then deal with all the privacy issues that come with that. But buildings are turning into the digital platform of the future. So they've gone from dumb concrete blocks, effectively, where people do stuff and people use technology for sure, but it's not really built into the building, to now being a fundamental part of how it works. So there are lots of anecdotes about just connectivity going off. People can't work in there if there's no connectivity. And if the connectivity does go off or something gets hacked, then the door access system might not work. And then if the door access system works and you can't get in, then there's very little commercial value from having a building you can't use. Now, of course, they're all really short term. So you're not going to suddenly lose a load of value just because it's turned off for half an hour. But there are ways, especially if you look at something like retail, offices are moving much more to that hospitality, fast moving model. If you can't use a building, people will just move somewhere else, and therefore the value very quickly and the income starts going down. So we're moving into a much faster moving world where absolutely cyber is about some of those problems. But there are it is a large part of the risk, but there are lots of just things that we haven't thought about in the past as well, about putting things in. And a lot of the time that's because we do things in bits, in retrospectively, rather than having an overall system approach.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And as we're going down this path of digital properties, I want to obviously talk about the metaverse, because that's the latest thing that we're talking about. And this idea that, you know, space is now going to reach beyond the physical space and into this, you know, conceptual view of space. What are your thoughts about the metaverse and all the activity that's going in that space at the moment, and how essentially buyers are starting to buy and build, shall we say, in metaverses that out there at the moment?
So I think there's probably quite a lot to say about the metaverse. So let me start off by saying that I think there's a lot of hot air around it, but I also think that hot air shouldn't necessarily detract from the fact that there is something out there that people are putting a lot of money into. I think the other thing to say is, if we talk about virtual real estate, that is by definition an oxymoron. So the real estate sector is attractive because you can go and kick the building. There's a pretty good chance it's going to be there tomorrow. It's going to have long-term income. There's only a finite amount of land and space out there. And of course, in the metaverse, none of that's true. So virtual real estate is a really interesting concept, which in itself is an oxymoron. I think a personal view about it is, having a world that we live in all the time that's digital, I think is some way off. I think there's going to be an interesting migration from the platforms that are out there at the moment to having a seamless experience where we can go through and we can meet up, and it almost doesn't matter what platform. You can keep the IP of things. I think there's probably a good use case of blockchain, not for the cryptocurrencies themselves, but to measure and track things that go on in the past and who owns what and IP. And maybe we could delve into that a little bit more as well. But I think that a lot of the people out there at the moment say that the metaverse is make believe, or they're very cynical about it, because either people talk about it a lot, and I think there's a lot of hot air, or they can't themselves really see themselves living, or even partly living, in a digital virtual world, or because even though I can see myself living in a virtual digital world, it's really blocky and it's not very attractive. Well, everything's going to get cheaper and better. Now, we can argue about whether that's going to be in the next 6 months or in the next 6 decades. But over the coming years, graphics are going to become better. Virtual reality is not going to make you feel seasick. Things are going to get much more integrated and virtual, and people are going to be much more comfortable being in a virtual world. And of course, things like this, we're still doing this virtually. This is across a screen. The gaming world is enormous. I think it was now bigger than music and film industry put together. People are on games and interacting with people. And I know anecdotally throughout lockdown, a lot of younger generations, and I don't think it's just about youth, but younger generations stayed in touch with people through games. Now, whilst I don't think that is a pure example of the metaverse, there is absolutely an appetite for people to interact and be sociable on those games. And so I think that the world is going to be moving towards that. Now, what does that mean for real estate? I think there are probably a couple of things. Firstly, for me at least, I think the world is going to end up being hybrid for a long time at least. So I think that we need to bring these two experiences together. So how do we try and bring the real space together with a virtual space? And I think it's going to be, sometimes you want to be real, sometimes virtual, and sometimes it's going to be a mix between the two. But I also think that whilst that might drive demand of some things down, like offices, for example, then it's also going to potentially drive demand up for other things. So more warehouses are perhaps going to be needed, or retail is going to be affected in some shape or form. Hospitality will be changed. So I think the view of metaverse, from my point of view, is it's a buzzword that's being associated with a lot at the moment. I think it always happens with a lot of buzzwords. I think virtual real estate is in itself an oxymoron. And I think it'll be very interesting to see from a real estate point of view if and how we apply our skills that we know in the real world to the virtual world. Someone somewhere is going to be valuing properties, virtual properties. Someone somewhere is going to be managing those virtual properties. And Existing property managers and valuers are going to be really well placed to do that, but it will need different skills, some similar ones and some different ones. And so there's an opportunity for us to really move into that space over the coming decade or two, or not to, and someone else will do it. So I think there are going to be some interesting consequences for real estate. I'm I guess a little bit cynical about what's being talked about at the moment, but I'm also open-minded that this is the direction of the world. And hardware is going to get cheaper, and graphics are going to get better, and data is going to become more available.
I do agree with you, and I'm glad you said that, because I feel like I'm being the sort of old school millennial trying to go back to the early 90s. But the reality is that I think where I kind of completely disagree is where people say that we won't need real estate anymore and we will never see each other and we will just live in the metaverse. I think those types of statements are just inaccurate, because it goes against, the basis of human psychology. We can't be on our own. We have to see people. We have to at some point. But I agree with you. I think a hybrid solution makes absolute sense. And of course, there's certain things or certain types of uses for real estate that you just can't get away from the physical. Like, we need a place to live, so residential will have to stay. Logistics will need to stay, because even if we stay at home all the time, well, we need to have our services and products delivered to us, and that needs warehouses. And, what about healthcare? You're going to need to go to a hospital, right? You can't get treated in the metaverse.
No, absolutely agree. And I think it's probably fair to say not many people do think that we'll be living in the metaverse 100% of the time. There's always going to be a small number of introverts who do want to be isolated, and so maybe they will. There's also those headlines about the metaverse is a load of rubbish and it's never going to be anything, or the metaverse is tomorrow and it's going to be everything. They're always going to be the ones that get the headlines and the reported ones. But I think some sort of blend in between as we devolve and move forward is going to be where the future is. So I think it's a pretty exciting future. I think what's really important for real estate is that absolutely building is going to be needed, but in perhaps a slightly different way. Types of building might have to evolve and be used differently. The buildings might have to accommodate different technology setups. So I think that the real estate sector needs to be very alive to it and think about it. But it's an evolution rather than anything else. And again, if you look back at some of the technologies that are out there, the top selling gift at the moment is those moleskin pads, and vinyl's being sold more than ever. There's just, book sales are going up. None of those are needed. They logically, none of those should really exist, because we've got digital versions of them now. Yet still, humans, we like more than that. And technology is always part of a solution, I think, for the majority of people, but it's not everything. And so we have to have that experience as well.
Yeah, I tried to download all my books going forward, but I'm a bit ashamed to say that I have bought some physical books recently, just because I wanted to touch and feel those. So I guess my next question for you is that, you kind of mentioned blockchain a little bit. That was, I feel, something that never really took off in real estate. I think we tried a number of times to think of some use cases, but it didn't really take off in any kind of significant way. But my question for you is what would you like to see more of within the data space? And I guess tied into that is, are there any missed opportunities where it relates to digital and data that you can see?
Yes. So what would I like to see more of? I think I'll probably go really basic and just start off with people accepting that data is a bigger topic than often they think it is, because to use a bit of a cliche, there's a lot of talk about big data and machine learning and artificial intelligence, all of which are buzzwords, but all of which actually really are driving the world that we live in, and there are some great use cases. Big data is not a spreadsheet. Big data is not a spreadsheet with an extra column or two on. Now, a lot of people think that, and that isn't necessarily a criticism, because of course that is a lot of data, but it's just a lack of education about how big data works as a science, or as a data science. And I think what I would urge anyone in real estate to do is just think a little bit more about data and how it operates and where the challenges are, where the risks are. And the best place to always start with any conversation about data, or frankly technology, is not with the data or the technology. What is it that you need to know to run your building better, or to make a better decision about your investments or your portfolio or whatever it might be? Because it really should be about about that question. What do you need to know? What's the problem? And then you can work backwards to work out what data and technologies out there, what you could use. So I guess make sure that you start with the outcome rather than thinking about the data and the technology. It's very possible to quickly get lost in the world of data and completely drown in it. So what's that outcome? But then also be a little bit more aware that in comparison to what we've had as a sector in the past and needed, there is now vast amounts of data that can do some pretty amazing things that we just haven't thought through.
Yeah, no, I agree. And as data SMEs, what would you like us to be doing more of? Because I agree with you, start with the outcome first, but how can we help organizations?
Well, I think there's probably a few different things there. So one is I'm bound to say that organizations such as ourselves, based on the experience and the knowledge that's out there, you can really bring in lessons from best practice from other clients all over the place to come in. And very often a real estate company, because it's just starting out or because it doesn't have a very big budget because it's a relatively small organization and the cash flow is relatively slow, whatever it might be, getting in the really large consultants to redesign something from scratch is often not the right approach or not a desirable approach. So there's something that we can do much more there. I think that we have a responsibility as small companies, but also the large ones as well, is dispelling some of the myths around data and just trying to explain it in pretty simple terms. And I think that there are a number of different ways that you can communicate about technology generally, but in particular data, which can be pretty misleading. And I think very often if you're presenting to real estate, if you're a real estate practitioner and someone's presenting to you about data and you've completely lost what they're talking about from scratch, they're probably not your fault. It's probably more the way it's being communicated rather than the way it's being received. Of course, there are always exceptions to that, but I think we need, as an industry, to be better talking about data. We need to engage much more with it. It isn't just spreadsheets. It's not just what we've done in the past. There's a whole world that's coming that for the people who really harness it is going to massively benefit. And the people who don't, it's going to be at worst inefficient and difficult. And they won't know why their assets aren't performing well. And at worst, even more so, there's going to be significant business risk, financial risk, and so on. So I think engaging with it, simplifying it, I think is something that all players have to come to terms with and talk about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Dan, I could sit here and talk to you forever about this topic, but I'm just conscious of time. So just to wrap up, I'm going to give you like an open question, which is what's next? What do you think is coming down the pipeline for real estate, for the Red Foundation, and for Alpha Prop Insight?
So I'm going to give you three slightly different answers. So the Red Foundation generally is getting traction. It's going forwards. I certainly urge anyone to go and have a look at the website and to sign up to the data ethical principles. And if anyone wants to get involved with any of the steering groups, then please do contact either me or the people on those groups. Where next? I think we're going to probably end up doing a little bit more of what we've done before. So the organisation is now established. It's supported by industry bodies like RICS and the British Property Federation and the Association of Real Estate Funds and so on. And hopefully we're going to get more of those signing up over time to give a really good flavour of the whole sector. So that's the direction of travel for that. And I think we're going to try and really raise awareness now. We've got a bedrock of activity. We've got the things that are out there. We've got the support. Now it's about really implementing it and moving it forward. In terms of the real estate sector, I think probably lots of different things. I think sustainability is going to remain top of the agenda for a long time, but a personal feeling is I think the narrative around it is going to change. I think we look at it in a very narrow way at the moment about carbon and energy use, both incredibly important and both really good signposts for all of those other things. But I think we're going to end up looking at a broader range of environmental sustainability type impacts, whether that's how much of a building is recycled or how much of the contents of a building is recycled, whether it's about the impact on ecosystems, whether it's about energy creation as well as energy use. So I think that topic is going to remain top of the agenda, and energy use and carbon is going to be really important, but I think it's going to go beyond just those measures as well. And we're going to have to very quickly come up with the data and the metrics to understand what that means for our buildings, how we report on it, how we measure it. I think inevitably I'm also going to say about the risk side of things. I think technology is fantastic. I think that sustainability is going to be top of the agenda for a long time. I think people are at top of the agenda. We're much more focused on people, but I think alongside that is going to be that that governance aspect. And I think you can probably look at ESG as a buzzword at the moment, but it really is focused on the E. I think E is going to expand. I think the S is going to become more important, where society becomes a much more important factor, and that governance over what we do in buildings generally as a sector, but in particular the digital risks that come. So I think we're going to slowly, over the next 2, 5, 10 years, see more examples of things being hacked, things coming out for entertainment purposes that look a little bit exciting and scary. And we're going to see that eventually moving into the insurance of buildings, the management of buildings, and the operation and the occupation of them.
No, amazing. All right, well, on that note, I think that's a good place to leave it for now. Thank you so much for taking this time to share your perspectives with me and have this conversation. And no doubt we will speak soon, especially in regards to data ethics.
Right, thank you very much, Yasra.